Now, let me ask you this. Have you ever had a neighbor who seemed like nothing but trouble, only to find out they were hiding something much bigger? It turns out, sometimes the most unsettling truths live just across the fence. In my case, what started with a simple boundary argument turned into a deep unraveling of family history. You can call me the guy who learned that sometimes what divides one yard from another might also divide bloodlines. This isn't about who I am. It's about what happened. I'd lived on Maple Street for 7 years with my wife, Belle, and our 2 kids. Quiet neighborhood. Friendly folks. A nice backyard separated from our neighbor's place by a chain-link fence that had clearly marked the property line since before we moved in. Next door lived a man named Kieran Hallbrook, probably around 65. Kieran had been in that house for over 3 decades. He mostly kept to himself, but he had an intense air about him, especially the way he'd linger by his kitchen window. Belle had mentioned more than once that it felt like he was watching us, though he never actually caused any trouble. So we went about our lives. That is, until a random Tuesday morning in March. I was sitting on the back porch, sipping my coffee, when Kieran suddenly marched across his yard. His face was flushed, his expression rigid with anger I'd never seen before. No hello, no small talk. That fence, he snapped, jabbing a finger toward the metal divider between our yards. It's sitting on my land. Always has been. I want it gone. I set my mug down, startled. What are you talking about? That fence was already here when we bought this house. Doesn't matter, he cut in. I had a survey done years ago. That fence is 1.5 feet into my yard. I've let it slide long enough. 18 inches. I stare at the fence line, baffled. If that's true, Kieran, why wait 7 years to bring it up? We've been living here all this time. His jaw clenched. I'm saying it now. Move the fence, or I'll get my attorney involved. And with that, he turned and walked off. But something about the whole interaction unsettled me. He wasn't just angry. He seemed panicked, like this was about more than a metal fence. Belle had been in the kitchen and clearly heard everything through the open window. He looked shaken, she said, arms wrapped around her waist. More than just mad, like he was afraid of something. She was right. There was a strange tension in Kieran that didn't match a simple property complaint. Why now? Why was it suddenly urgent to reclaim 18 inches of land that hadn't mattered in 30 years? Over the next few days, his behavior took a strange turn. He'd stand in his yard for hours, eyes locked on the fence. Sometimes he'd take photos. Other times, he'd pace with a tape measure, scribbling in a small notebook. When our kids played outside, Belle noticed him watching them from his window, expression unreadable but unblinking. I don't like this, she whispered one night as we watched him tracing property line yet again. Something about this is wrong. I agreed, so I pulled up the public property records, both ours and Kieran's. According to the county records, our property line ran exactly where the fence stood, but documents can be wrong. And Kieran seemed absolutely convinced. A week later, things escalated. I came home to a formal letter on our doorstep. It was from Kieran's lawyer, demanding we move the fence within 30 days or face a lawsuit. Attached to it was a copy of an old property survey, dated 1994, which appeared to back up Kieran's claim, stating that the fence sat 18 inches onto his land. But something fell off. The numbers were precise, sure, but there was something about the document, maybe the formatting or the lettering, that didn't sit right. Belle and I spent the evening weighing our options. We could pay a couple $1,000 to move the fence and avoid the headache, or we could challenge it. But my gut told me this wasn't about the fence. I say we get our own survey done. I said, finally, if he's right, we'll move it. But I want to know for sure. The next morning, I called Meridian Land Surveying. I explained the situation to the owner, Dennis Crawford. Neighbor feud over fence line, he asked. Happens all the time. Usually turns out the fence is exactly where it should be, but folks get confused about old boundaries. That's what I'm hoping, I replied. My neighbor's got a survey from '94 saying it's on his property, but something about it seems off. There was a pause on the line. Did you catch who did the survey? Dennis asked. I glanced at the letter. Brookside Land Services. Another pause, longer this time. Brookside's been out of business for years. Dennis said slowly. Mitchell Brookside lost his license. Something about forged reports. Dennis's warning echoed in my head. Get your own survey. Don't rely on that old one. The moment I hung up, a chill ran through me. The survey Kieran had been leaning on, the one from 1994, suddenly felt a lot more suspicious. If the man behind it had lost his license for forging documents, what else could be false? That Thursday, a young surveyor named Tyler showed up around 9 a.m. He spent close to 3 hours in the yard. He was thorough, checking original boundary markers, referencing GPS data, and measuring the fence with practiced precision. Kieran was watching from his kitchen window the entire time. I noticed his hands tremble slightly as he raised his coffee mug. Not from age, but something closer to nerves. Once Tyler had packed up his gear, I approached him. Well, I asked. He gave a small smile. Good news. The fence is actually about 2 inches inside your property line. So technically, you could even move it closer to your neighbor's yard if you wanted to. A huge wave of relief washed over me, but his face didn't match his words. There's something else, Tyler added, casting a glance toward Kieran's place. When I checked the rear corner pin, the one that defines the edge of the yard on your shared boundary, I noticed something strange. My brow furrowed. Strange how? It's been moved, he said bluntly. Someone dug it up and shifted it roughly 18 inches west, which pushes it into what should be your property. Judging by the aged concrete around it, I'd estimate it was moved sometime in the mid-90s. And just like that, everything made sense. Kieran's survey wasn't lying, because the marker was in the wrong place to begin with. Whoever repositioned that pin had manipulated the boundary on paper. My stomach turned. Someone had altered the marker on purpose, to make it look like our fence was encroaching. But who would go that far? And why? Tyler handed me a preliminary report. I'll have a finalized survey for you by Monday, he said. But I can tell you right now, your fence is in the clear. The real question is whether your neighbor knows that pin was tampered with. That night, I shared everything with Belle. We sat on the couch, the report in my hands, her eyes scanning each line. So the fence was never on his land? She asked. No, I replied. But someone went out of their way to make it look that way. Who would do something like that? I had a sickening guess, but I needed proof. That weekend, I drove down to the county courthouse and requested historical property files for both our home and Kieran's. I wanted everything, all the dusty records, maps, and filings that stretched back decades. And what I found changed everything. Kieran's house had been his family since 1962. His parents, Richard and Dorothy Hallbrook, had been the original owners. Then I found a filing from 1993. Richard had submitted a request for a property line adjustment, claiming that a past survey had been inaccurate and that he actually owned an additional 18 inches along the eastern edge, the border shared with our lot. The request had been approved. The justification? A survey completed by Brookside Land Services, the same firm whose founder lost his license for falsifying records. But that wasn't the worst of it. Richard Hallbrook had died in early 1994, just 3 months after the adjustment went through. Dorothy passed away 2 years later. And Kieran had inherited the home, which many had known. He'd known that those extra 18 inches weren't truly his. He'd been living with that knowledge and the guilt of it for 30 years. Suddenly, everything fit. Kieran's obsession with the fence, his strange urgency, the shaky hands. He wasn't fighting to reclaim land. He was trying to legitimize a lie. But why now? What had changed after all these years? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. On Monday morning, Tyler returned with the finalized survey. As we chatted on the porch, he casually mentioned something that made everything click. I think your neighbor's been trying to sell his place, he said. My buddy works at Century Real Estate and mentioned a seller on Maple Street running into title issues over boundary lines. Kieran was selling. The fraud, the fake adjustment, the moved pin must have been discovered during the title search. And now, Desperate to avoid losing the sale, he'd try to get me to move the fence voluntarily, to make it look like the adjusted property line was real. That evening, I walked across the yard with a survey in hand and knocked on Kieran's door. He answered, looking utterly exhausted. He'd aged years in a matter of weeks. "We need to talk," I said. He nodded silently and let me inside. The living room was filled with half-packed boxes. He was clearly preparing to leave. I placed the report on the kitchen table. "I know about the marker," I said. "I know it was moved in 1993. I know your father hired that fraudulent surveyor." Kieran sat down heavily. His shoulders sank as if a weight had finally been allowed to drop. "I've been carrying this for 3 decades, he said, voice quiet. "My dad wasn't a bad man. He just believed the previous owners had been using part of our yard for years. He thought he was taking back what was his. So he paid the surveyor extra to shift the pin and file the adjustment. But you knew it was wrong." He nodded. "I did. After they died, I considered coming clean. But you'd already moved in. The fence was there. I figured, what's the point? I'd just live with it. Until now. The title company caught it?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "They flagged the adjustment. Said it didn't look right and needed verification." I panicked. I thought if I could get you to move the fence on your own, maybe the records wouldn't matter. I know it was a long shot, but I couldn't bring myself to tell the buyers that my father basically stole part of someone's yard. He looked at me then, eyes rimmed with decades of guilt. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have told you everything sooner." In the end, resolving it wasn't difficult. Kieran hired a lawyer to file paperwork with the county, reversing the fraudulent boundary change. The original lines were restored. The title was cleared. 3 weeks later, Kieran's house sold. He moved to Florida to be near his daughter. Before he left, he came over one last time with a bottle of wine and a handwritten letter explaining everything. The lie, his father's motives, and the decades he'd spent burying the truth. "I never wanted to be someone who lived with a lie," he said. "But the longer you carry it, the harder it becomes to let it go." As I watched him drive away that final time, I realized this had never really been about offense. It was about guilt, and how deeply it can root itself in the spaces we think we own. The fence still stands exactly where it always has. But now I see it differently. It's not just a divider between yards. It's a symbol of everything that separates truth from deception, and the courage to admit the past and the fear of facing it. The new folks who bought Kieran's house seem nice. They've never once mentioned the fence. If you've made it this far, hit that subscribe, and remember, some of life's biggest conflicts happen right outside our back doors.